Hi again, everyone. How are you doing? I hope you're all doing well. We're doing French baguettes this time. So we've learned a lot about yeast already. Hopefully you watched some of the other demos. So I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. This one's called a lean dough because if you notice in the recipe, there's no fat in the recipe at all. There's no butter, oil, margarine, or anything like that. So it's called a lean dough. So we're going to start just like we usually do. I have sugar already dissolved in our warm water. I've tested the temperature of the water and it is about 110 degrees. Remember, nice warm water. Okay, I'm going to sprinkle the yeast in. Okay, just sprinkle the yeast on top and then we will let that sit for about 5 minutes until it gets foamy. Make sure all your yeast is in the water and not stuck to the side of your bowl. Okay, we'll let that stand for 5 minutes. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes since the yeast was sprinkled onto the sugar water, and you should see some foam. If you've still got granules of yeast on top, give it a little stir and then wait another minute or two, and you'll see it should get nice and foamy once you get it all dissolved in. So make sure you stir the granules if they haven't gotten wet yet into the water, and that will help activate it, which is what happened to mine. I still had a few granules in there, so I stirred it up a little bit, got it all wet, and then now it's gotten quite foamy and active. All right, so set that aside for a second. We're going to go through your recipe. Okay, so that was 65 milliliters of warm water. I am actually doubling the recipe because a lot of you are at home now feeding your families. So this recipe in school, in class, was making 1 loaf between 2 people. So my family is a family of 5, so I easily could triple this recipe, but I decided doubling it was quite easy. So 65 mils of warm water, I doubled it to about 125. I know it would have been 130, but approximately. Okay, so about 125, 130 warm water. 8 mils of yeast is what the recipe says. I used 15 mils of yeast. 3 mils of sugar. I used 5 mils of sugar. That's what's in there. Okay. Your next step, so I've done step 1, combine the warm water and sugar in a small bowl. I just used my liquid measure. Okay. Sprinkled the yeast over and let it stand for 5 minutes until it was foamy. Okay. And then I stirred it all up. Okay. Now I'm on step 2. In a large bowl, I'm combining the salt, remaining sugar, and yeast mixture. Okay, so here's my salt and the extra sugar. So keep note, there's 2 amounts of sugar in this recipe. The first amount goes in with your yeast. Second amount goes in now with your dry mixture. Okay, so I've got salt and sugar in here. Okay, and I'm going to add my yeast mixture now. And you see all that foam on the sides? Make sure you get your rubber spatula and scrape all that off. You don't want all your yeast stuck to your liquid measure. Okay. And even off my spoon too. All right, so I'm combining my salt, sugar, yeast mixture, and another amount of warm water. So the recipe says 125. Okay, I'm just using 250. Remember to check that it's not too hot, that you're not going to kill your yeast. So nice and warm, that water goes in there. The extra 125 milliliters or 250 if you're doubling the recipe. Okay, and now I'm going to add the flour gradually, stirring well after each addition. Okay? And just give that a good mix. And then I have my pre-sifted flour here. 440 milliliters of pre-sifted flour. I just sifted it ahead of time and then measured again. So I am using double the amount, which is 880 mils of flour. Now you want to put it in gradually, so you can just take a scoop and scoop that in about a cup at a time or so. Okay, so gradually add this in until you have a ragged dough. So we've made dough a few times now, so you should know what a ragged dough looks like. It's dough that kind of pulls away from the side of the edge, and why they call it ragged dough is it's supposed to look like cut up rags. Okay, so if you kind of look at it closely, it'll look like cut up cloth, which is what rags are. So at this point, we can do our step 3. Okay. If your dough is too dry, if you've added all that flour in and then you find it too dry, you can add a little bit more water if you need to. But you want to try and not add water, then it gets too sticky, then you add more flour, then it gets too dry. Because, you know, we've all cut our bangs before where you cut a little on one side, oh, uneven, cut a little more on the other side, and next thing you know, you have no bangs. This dough will become a monster if we keep adding water, then flour, then water, then flour, and it will not be a tasty ball of dough. It'll just be flour and water. Okay? So we want to avoid that. So we want to try and just get the right consistency. Okay? So I have a little bit of flour left here. I can use that while I'm kneading. So if I find the dough too sticky, I'll just add that in while I'm kneading. Okay? So I'm going to turn it onto a lightly floured surface now. So either I can use some extra flour, I'll just use the flour that was in my bowl. Okay, so we're ready to do our kneading, push, fold, turn. Again, you want to have flour on the heel of your hand. If it's too sticky, push, fold, turn. Look at this mass, it's just not holding its shape at all. So that's why we need to develop this gluten to hold that carbon dioxide in. So it's a dough, but it's a very soft, unstructured dough. So by now you want to see that your dough is smooth and that it is elastic. So right now, if I pulled on this, it's kind of glue-like. It's not holding anything together. Okay, so let's knead for 5 to 8 minutes. Okay, and see how we do. Okay, so remember, push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. More flour if you need it. Push, fold, turn. Okay, it's been about 8 minutes now. And look how nice and smooth that dough is now. Okay, it's smooth as a baby's bottom, they say. Okay, opening up the surface just to see those tiny little blisters. See those right there? Okay. And then another test they use in test kitchens is taking, and it's called the Windowpane Test. And it's taking some of the dough and pulling it apart, and it should be able to stretch to a very thin dough that you could see light through. Okay, so I wanted to show you what I meant by that Windowpane test. So I've changed the angle up to the window here. So when I pull on this dough, I'm just letting the weight of the dough pull on it, and you'll see that this stretches to a nice thin dough. So if it can hold the stretched out dough in a sheet that can see the light through it, that is good. Okay, so again, you see how smooth it is. We've tried the Windowpane test, and now we've gotten it into a nice smooth ball. Okay, so now's the time to let it rest for 1 hour or until it gets doubled in size. Okay, so you can either put it into a greased Ziploc bag, which is what we would do in class, and wait till the next morning. If you refrigerate it, if you refrigerate your dough, make sure you bring it back to room temperature before you start to try and shape it or roll it. Or at home, we can just put a little oil into your bowl, okay, and then take your dough, roll it around in that oil, spread that oil all the way up the sides of the bowl, and then flip that dough over so that it's greased on top. Then we're going to cover this with plastic wrap and then let it sit for about an hour in a warm, draft-free place. Okay, here is the dough after 1 hour of proofing. Look how nice and high it's risen. Double the size, and I have greased the top, thankfully, so that this plastic comes off nice and easily. Okay, keep the plastic for the next proofing after we've shaped it. So I'll just set that aside for a moment. And remember, we're going to punch down. So we're on day 2. where we're shaping it into a cylinder. Don't forget to punch the big bubble. You can see there's a huge bubble there, and we don't want that in our bread, so we're going to punch that down. See those big air pockets, okay, being released? We'll gather that dough. Now remember, I had doubled my dough. See how it's sticking a little bit? Good thing I had grease on there. Even with the grease, it was sticking a little bit. So thankfully, I greased it, and those little bits are coming off. Okay. Okay. So I doubled the dough. So I'm going to cut this in half, and then we will shape it. So we'll shape 2 loaves. Okay, because the original recipe shaped 1 French baguette loaf. Okay. Now we're going to do 2. Okay. Lightly floured surface, and you're going to shape it into a long French loaf. Now you see this rough side. We want to roll that under so that the top side is nice and smooth. See that? So just any extra, so I'm taking my fingers and tucking in the bottom so that the top looks nice and smooth. And then we can roll that out. So I'm taking my hands in the middle, going forward and back, and just gently stretching to the right and left as I'm rolling. Now we're just going to put the plastic wrap back over it because it is greased. It's nice and greasy on that side. Just make sure the grease is all over. Okay. And then we'll put a tea towel over top of that and let that rest while the oven is preheating. About 10 or 15 minutes or so in a warm place. Okay, well, I have to admit something. They rose a little longer than I meant for them to rise. They rose about, this is probably after about 25 minutes to 30 minutes of proofing time after we've shaped. So they're rising. Look how huge they've got. They've definitely doubled in size. I'm going to pop it into the oven at 450 degrees for the first 10 minutes. And then we're going to reduce the heat down to 400 and continue baking for another 15 minutes. I have put a pan of water into the oven already as it was preheating, so that will develop that nice chewy crust that French bread is famous for. Okay, that sort of crispy, chewy crust. And there they are, golden brown out of the oven now. Tap them. Nice and hollow sounding. They look a little bit more like a French loaf, so if you want a baguette, you would make them a little skinnier and longer. Okay. Bon appetit! There's our French bread cut in half. You can see the air pockets.
2, 1, action.
There's our beautiful French bread we're having for dinner. Awesome. Nothing like fresh bread.